incoming president. Oh, okay, I got it. I got it here. And Lillian Birkenheim is our secretary and IT specialist. And if it weren't for Lillian, we really couldn't do this as well as we do. So thank you. And Dan Beal is on our board on a leave of absence. Ken Bernstein, Aaron Chase with the Huntington, Art Cueto, who's with us, Ken Farfsing, Todd Gish can't be with us, Catherine Perez, Meredith Drake Rattan, Alan Rifkin who's here, Betsy Wiseman who's here, and Sergio who couldn't make it. This Conversations with the Author series started a while back, and it's highlighting important research and history in the areas of planning and community development. Our series has included, since June of 2001, David Sloan, who wrote Is the Cemetery Dead? And that was, well, he even spoke at our Rotary Club, and it was well embraced, you know. Ken Bernstein spoke with us about preserving Los Angeles. Ken Farfsing, who's with us, he wrote Black Gold in Paradise, and I keep saying it's just a wonderfully written book. And he's just opened up Signal Hill to all of us. Barry Siegel, Dreamers and Schemers, about the 32 Olympics. Liz Folletta, architect and teaching professor, USC, By Right, By Design. Josh Stevens, author of The Urban Mystique, Notes on California, Los Angeles, and Beyond. And our last one, DJ Waldy, Becoming Los Angeles, Myth, Memory, and a Sense of Place. He also is assistant city manager, by the way, of Lakewood, and we're getting a tour Saturday, which is nice. And then June 19th or 29th, Vinayak Barney, who some of you know, he's with Moulin Polizordes. He also teaches at USC School of Architecture. And he will be speaking to us on a fairly recent book, Streets for All, 50 Strategies for Shaping Resilient Cities. And then importantly, and this will be discussed a little bit later, I would like to announce our upcoming colloquium, Los Angeles Olympics, 1932, 1984, 2028, Lessons from the Past for the Future. It'll be held at the Huntington Library, Gardens and Museum. It's Saturday, May 20th of this year. And it'll be 8:30 arrival and leave roughly at 2 p.m. So I hope we'll get more information out and talk about it toward the end of the thing. This evening's conversation is with Bill Fulton, who fortunately was able to join us from Houston. Place and Prosperity, How Cities Help Us Connect and Innovate. Bill's previous books include, and I know all of you know these because you're all planning, Guide to California Planning, The Reluctant Metropolis, and The Regional City, Planning for the End of Sprawl. Yes. Moderating tonight's discussion will be Josh Stevens, and he's contributing editor to the California Planning and Development Report, which Bill founded, I believe, and he's a member of our advisory council. And then after Bill's presentation, Josh is going to engage him in a discussion, and then after that, we encourage you to participate orally. Chat rooms are wonderful, but engaging you as where you're from and how you think and how you phrase things and who you are, it comes across better than in a chat room. Josh, I'll turn things over to you to moderate the presentation. So, Josh.
All right. Thank you, Marcia. Good evening, everyone. Delighted to be back here. Appreciated the chance to talk about my book about a year ago, and really glad to be back with Bill and with you all. And so, as Marcia alluded, this is a little bit conspiratorial because Bill and I are in touch on an almost daily basis anyway, and we know each other really well, but hopefully we can make it interesting for you all. I'll add a little bit to the bio that Marcia mentioned. I'll first mention that this is sort of how Bill and I work, because we're always in cyberspace, whether Bill's in Houston, I'm in LA, or any number of points in between. So even though we're talking about place, it's nice that we can use the internet to get together. But Bill has been all over the place. And I think that if you've read the book, you don't need my introduction, because the book is very autobiographical to an extent, going from upstate New York and Syracuse University to Los Angeles, to the Luskin School at UCLA, the inaugural planning commission of the city of West Hollywood, Mayor Ventura, founding a planning firm there, becoming a planning director of San Diego, working for Smart Growth America. And most recently, Bill is the emeritus director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice University. So he has dipped a toe into Houston, or much more than a toe. And
I think I'm up to an ankle at least. I'm up to an ankle at least.
Right. Hopefully on high ground. And
well, there is no high ground in Houston.
There we go. and we will get to that. But
yeah, we'll get to that.
You know, I think he's been in many different places at pivotal moments in their history, or he has made them pivotal moments through his interpretation and study of them. So I think, you know, I think one thing I want to do tonight is, we're all familiar with California. I would love to highlight, you know, some of the non-California places that Bill has observed, hopefully for everyone's benefit. So that's my introduction. So I'd like to start with a very specific moment in the book, and it comes early, and it strikes me as potentially the most emotional of moments. And there are several emotional moments in the book, but here's the book itself, Place and Prosperity. I should add, published by Island Press, which publishes a lot of urban books. I think they do so heroically. They've given a voice to so many great planners and planning related authors. But in this essay early on, we have a photo of Auburn, New York, which isn't quite showing up on my Zoom.
Yeah, because you have blur in the background.
Because I have blur in the background. Oh, Marcia's helping me out. And it's an aerial photo of downtown Auburn, which is not nearly as large as downtown LA or downtown Houston, but it doesn't have the dates, but one shows a dense downtown full of brick buildings, looks like 3- and 4-story, with a sort of irregular streetscape. The next, half those buildings are gone. The streets have been reconfigured. And Bill, I wonder if you could tell us sort of, what do those photos represent to you, and how do they reflect your inspiration for and sensibilities about urban planning?
Well, thanks, Josh, and thanks, everybody. It's great to see so many familiar faces. Although I devoted most of my...
Hi, Angie. This is Alan Rifkin, returning.
As I have, I've spent most of my career in Southern California, but as Josh said, I did grow up in this small 30,000 population factory town in upstate New York, sort of triangulated by Syracuse, Rochester, and Cornell in the Finger Lakes. And one of the things that I say in the book is that when I was a kid, which is a long time ago now for me, as it is for many of you, everything revolved around the downtown in this little town. Everything I ever did as a kid was in the downtown, whether it was going to the movies, going to the doctor, going to the department store, whatever. And one of the things that happened in this town has happened in so many towns, what I like to say, there's a kind of a joke that many people say is back in Auburn, is that Auburn was too well connected at HUD during the time of urban renewal. The former city manager went to work there. The guy who was the mayor at the time was the president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And so what happened simultaneously in the 70s was HUD gave a whole bunch of money to the city to try to, and to be fair, many of these buildings are obsolete. Arson was a problem. Adaptive reuse was not thought of at that time. That the city backed up to the river, as so many cities like that did, and they tried to punch it open. And so simultaneously, what happened was that the urban renewal knocked down half the downtown. The New York State DOT came in and 1 block away built a giant arterial. And then, by the way, they were also separating the sewers at the same time. All federally funded projects. And at the very beginning of the book, I tell a recollection where, as a young reporter, young journalist in my teens, I went to a meeting of the Urban Renewal Authority, and I walked from the newspaper office to the Urban Renewal Authority office in City Hall, and it was like walking through a war zone because there was all this demolition going on at that time. And it was only many years later, Josh, about 10 years ago, I was getting ready to, CNU had their summit in Buffalo, and they asked me to come and give a keynote speech. The two keynote speakers that year were, if you can imagine this, me and Jim Kunstler. If you can imagine following Jim Kunstler. But it made me realize that as a young man, in my late teens and early 20s, I had experienced this kind of what I came to think of as urban renewal PTSD. And that led me, I now realize, although I wasn't conscious of it at the time, to a desire to devote a lot of my career to trying to heal some of these other cities that had been harmed by urban renewal and by freeway construction in the 60s and 70s. And that goes on to this day. I live now in Houston. I live about 4 blocks away from I-45, and there's a huge fight between the locals and TxDOT and Buttigieg, Secretary Buttigieg's office about how to expand I-45. So I can talk later if you want about how that affected me, you know, what it was like to grow up in this factory town in upstate New York and then as a young man moved to LA, because that was pretty jarring. But that was really, I realized the foundation of my interest in cities and urban planning was growing up in this very distinctive city with a lot of place character and watching so much of it get destroyed when I was 17, 18, 19 years old.
Let me follow up on that. Obviously, I think most of us today probably lament urban renewal. Do you remember what the attitude was at the time? Did the adults around you have an opinion about what was happening or what was to come after that? You know, other than the people who had the federal dollars in their minds.
Well, there were several philosophies. My father, who was a salesman and a public relations guy, but had an intuitive understanding of cities and place, just hated it and basically left town as a result and never went back. The power structure was supportive of it, partly because it was jobs and it was progress. After I wrote the opening essay in the book about Auburn, I was contacted by one of my high school classmates who now lives in Palm Springs, and his father was on the city council at the time of all this. And the line came, you know, I would say towns like this were run by the Democratic Party, the police department, and the mafia, which were all basically the same people, right? They were all each other's cousins. And the party line was, we're going to do this because this is going to help update the town. And of course, there was a lot of just construction and demolition jobs, and there was economic activity there short-term economic activity that a lot of people wanted. But there was a belief that, so this is very instructive to me thinking about California today. So California today, for the first time in 170 years, is losing population, right? And the entire California planning system is based on the assumption that population is going to continue to increase. In the 60s and 70s in New York State, both downstate and upstate, it was the same thing. In upstate New York, the population had been growing since the Erie Canal, 130, 140 years. No one imagined that population would stagnate or decline. So, for example, in Rochester, they sewered the entire county on the assumption that, on the backs of the city taxpayers, on the assumption that the entire county would get developed. And then, of course, for a variety of reasons, population growth stopped in upstate New York and has never continued. It's never gone up again. And so there was an assumption that if you tore down all these old buildings, there would be a market for new development. And I remember being very struck, 18 years old, as a young journalist attending this Urban Renewal Authority meeting. It was the city council sitting as the Urban Renewal Authority. And they had just cleared the prime location downtown, what they believed to be the prime parcel. And they were astonished that there were no developers who were interested in developing it. And so they said, well, you have to understand the Northeast to understand this story, and I'll explain it if you don't understand it. They said, well, there's this grocery chain in Rochester that's kind of interested, so maybe we'll go over and talk to them and maybe they'll do something. And so they went to the corporate headquarters of Wegmans, which is sort of the Gelson's of the Northeast, right? And Wegmans came in and built a very traditional suburban supermarket on this prime parcel, which is still there, right in the middle of the downtown. But I think it was unimaginable. The factories were just beginning to close. It was unimaginable to anybody that there would be no market. And they were pretty astonished when it turned out that there was no market. And one of the things that I'm very interested in, and I want to learn more about and possibly write about, is what happens to California after 170 years of unrelenting population growth, if all of a sudden for decades, as in New York, there is no population growth. And what does that do to how does that undermine the underpinnings of the planning system? Because it certainly did that in New York State at that time.
I want to get to more the present day fairly quickly, but I want to take one more.
But the point of this group is to point of this group is to not be in the present day, right? Or at least not.
So you wrote something very astonishing, which is in one sort of parenthetical note, you say that to this day, you still don't quite know why you came to California. I want to put you on the spot and ask you to, for a city where want to be movie stars and rock stars and, the proverbial fruits and nuts all roll down to, was it really that passive,
Yes. Yes, it was.
what kept you here, or what concatenation of events kept you here and kept you interested?
Well, the reason, so when I was about 25, I had been living in Washington, D.C., and I'm a policy wonk, so I assumed that D.C. would be my permanent home. In fact, I tried to make that happen twice in my life, once when I was young and once when I was older. Didn't stick either time. And both times it was kind of because, this is kind of a claustrophobic place. Inside the Beltway is a kind of claustrophobic place. So after living in D.C. for a while, as a young man, about age 25, I felt the need to sort of take a breath and stretch my legs. And I went on a cross-country trip. And I got to Texas. It was December, and I got to Texas. And I said, what do I do now? And I remember going to the Dallas Public Library and looking at the classified ad section of the Los Angeles Times, because there was no internet in those days, which was the largest classified ads, the largest jobs wanted ad section I'd ever seen. And I said, well, I can at least wait out the winter in LA. I mean, it's warm and you can always get a job, right? So I did that. So I went to LA with the intent to wait out the winter there. I applied for a couple jobs in the Northeast, which I didn't get. And if I'd gotten one, I would have moved back. But almost immediately, I was fascinated by the urban morphology and the urban history of LA. A couple of random things happened. One was that by a complete coincidence, within 1 week of landing in LA, I wound up as the fill-in secretary at Katz Hollis, which was a redevelopment consulting firm run by Cal Hollis. Like within 1 week of being in LA, I was Cal Hollis's secretary, right? So immediately I got an inside understanding of redevelopment in California within my first month. And then through a very strange set of circumstances, I wound up getting an internship at SCAG. And within 2 or 3 months, I was up at the University Library at UCLA trying to research and understand the planning history of LA, because it was just so fascinating to me. And that was the beginning of my thought about writing The Reluctant Metropolis, which was not published until 16 years later. But that was where I began to think about it. And it was in the back of my head to go to planning school. And then one day I remember, I'll never forget this. It was 1 year after I had moved to LA, and I was driving. It was a beautiful, January day. I was driving on Mulholland Drive, one of those classic Chamber of Commerce LA days. And all of a sudden it dawned on me that I had established residency in the state of California for the purposes of going to the University of California. And I literally went home and applied to Berkeley and UCLA planning schools that day. And once I was in UCLA planning school, then I was not going to leave.
More to the present day. So a lot of your observations, especially in the first half of the book, refer to thickening and thinning. And there are a lot of nuances to that of density and centeredness and how these cities are laid out. And you make some comparisons between East and West Coast. I wonder if you could sort of explain that, and sort of, is that a thesis that came about as you were compiling these essays, or is that thesis you had in mind and these essays kind of?
Well, that was actually right. That after the Auburn essay, the second essay in the book is about thickening and thinning metropolises, and actually that essay began as a lecture I gave at Cornell about quite a long time ago. Some of you may know Professor Rolf Pendahl, now at the University of Illinois. Rolf got his PhD at Berkeley, and he put on a conference at Cornell some time ago called The Thinning Metropolis. He had gotten fascinated with upstate New York and with the Northeast. And he asked me to come and be one of the speakers. So I gave this speech about where I compared the small town in rural Northeast where I grew up as the thinning metropolis, comparing it to the Southern California, which I called the thickening metropolis, where one of those areas is getting attenuated and spread out, and the other is getting more and more packed in. And there's a variety of reasons for that. And one of the things I tell in the story, tell in the book, was when I was growing up in upstate New York, on my block, there were no fences. There's not uncommon in the Northeast and the Midwest, because half the year you can't go outside anyway. There were no fences, and all of the kids in the neighborhood would run up and down on everybody's backyard all day, all afternoon, even the backyards of the people who didn't have kids. And when I told my daughter this, she didn't believe, who grew up in Ventura, of course, she didn't believe me. And I realized, well, if you did that in Southern California today, there would be about 10 years of litigation as a result of that. So there is a very striking difference between the Southwest and the West, which is low to the ground but high density. It's high density single family. And the rest of the country, the South, the Midwest, and the Northeast, which is sprawling with large lots. It's a very, very stark difference between particularly the Southwest, but the Southwest and the West Coast generally, and the rest of the country.
Let's see. I'm going to jump around, and I think one fun essay is your favorite street. I'd like you to tell the audience what your favorite street is, and especially what that street has to do with post-pandemic or mid-pandemic and post-pandemic life.
Right. And my favorite street has changed in nature in a way that I'm not sure I completely like. But my favorite street, of course, is Main Street in Ventura. If you've ever been to downtown Ventura, Main Street is a wonderful little street. It's the main street in the downtown. It really doesn't go anywhere, which is part of the reason why it's nice. And the story that I tell in the book about my favorite street, and my point about streets, is not only was I making the point that streets aren't only for cars, but are for other uses, which is a point that many urban planners and others often make, but that a street can play a different role at different times. And particularly Main Street in Ventura can be a street that cars drive down. It can be a street that cruiser cars drive down. It can be a street you can close off for a special event, which happened several times when I was on the city council. Usually when Kevin Costner came to town and wanted to play a concert with his band right on Main Street in downtown. He's probably the most famous native of Ventura. And so my point was that a street, one of the wonderful things about a street is that it doesn't always have to play the same role all the time. Sometimes it can be a street for cars. Sometimes it can be a street for pedestrians. Sometimes it can be a street for different kinds of activities. Now, what happened during COVID, not surprisingly, is that about 4 or 5 blocks in the main street of the downtown got closed off to allow the restaurants to have outdoor dining. And this has now become permanent. There's about 5 blocks in downtown Ventura that used to be, and I remember when I was mayor, I fought the parking meter war over those very blocks to reinstall parking meters for the first time in 40 years. Now, of course, there's no cars that park there because the street is blocked off permanently to make way for the restaurants. On the one hand, that's really great, but on the other hand, it limits the flexibility of the ability to use the street for different purposes at different times. And I have to tell you a funny story. About 2 months ago, I went to Ventura. I think I took the train from San Diego. I was in San Diego. I took the train and I got off the train at about 9 o'clock at night, and I had to go to where I was staying. And I literally walked with my roller bag down the middle, 9 o'clock at night, down the middle of Main Street, right in the middle of Main Street, down on Ventura, no cars, and it was very eerie, right? So I have mixed emotions about the permanent closing of the street, because I think there's a lot to be said about being able to use a street flexibly for whatever purpose is most useful at any particular time.
While we're on it, there have been so many post-pandemic predictions. Do you have predictions for the long-term urban impacts of the pandemic and how people feel about it?
Yeah, right at the beginning of COVID, I made about 5 predictions. And this is not in the book. This will be in the next book probably. I predicted first of all that retail would not, excepting restaurants and food and beverage, that retail would crash and burn for a long time, which hasn't happened quite the way I expected. But I think the main thing that I predicted was that all activity centers would have to become more diverse and more interesting. You would no longer have, and we've seen this in Manhattan and in downtown San Francisco, you no longer have the throngs of commuters coming in every day in order to prop up the lunchtime economy and the happy hour economy, right? So if downtowns want people there, you have to have more reasons other than just your office is there to be interesting. Meanwhile, I think suburbs have to become more interesting as people work at home, because if you're used to dining, having lunch in Midtown Manhattan or going to a cool bar after work, and now you're working at home in the suburbs, are you really going to be happy with Applebee's? I keep expecting Applebee's to sue me, as I've said this repeatedly. And so I think that all of the activity centers, urban and suburban, are going to have to become more diverse and more interesting. It was very interesting. I was working on a project recently in Nassau County on Long Island. And the most startling fact that I saw was, there's 2 startling facts about post-pandemic suburbia. One is Nassau County's got 1.5 million people, but it's just a big bedroom suburb. 20% of the workforce now works at home in Nassau County. They all used to work in Manhattan, right? The other thing that happened, not surprisingly, was that sales tax revenues in Nassau County spiked during COVID, because nobody's spending their money in Manhattan anymore. They're spending it at home. But I do think that urban downtowns and not just downtowns, but business districts like Century City are going to have to become more diverse, have a wider range of activities to attract people, and then suburban places are going to have to become more interesting and have better town centers to draw people out of their homes. I can remember many years ago, I I created a kind of a typology of places which I called it the urban hotel, the suburban workshop, and the rural metropolis. You know, and certainly the urban hotel and the suburban workshop have been borne out in COVID, right? Your suburban home or your coffee shop is where you do your actual work. The urban location is where you meet other people. Another term that's been used for downtowns or urban districts, you know, business districts after COVID is the productive resort. You know, where you go there to get together with other people and produce. And so I think that downtowns, I'm a little bit surprised that the office work that remote work has been so sticky. I didn't expect it to be that sticky. I expected more people to go back to the office more often. But I think the other thing it's done, and this is really important to not overlook, is it's really created a class distinction between white collar and blue collar workers. White collar workers can all work at home. Blue collar workers can't, and service workers can't. And that creates a much greater dichotomy and an equity problem. It highlighted an equity problem that was already there. You know, all through COVID, I sat in my house and had some Amazon delivery driver deliver me things every day, so I didn't have to go anywhere. Well, that was fine for me, but not for him, right? I think that's going to come home to roost, and that's going to be something that we're going to have to deal with in the future.
Let me ask a contrasting question, which is, we like walking on Ventura Main Street, pandemic or no. What's it like walking in Houston? And what does walking in Houston represent about the rest of Houston?
Right. Well, one of the things that, there's an essay in the book, which I believe is called something like "Why I'm Afraid to Walk in Houston," and I had the inspiration for the book when I almost got run down on an arterial street, on an arterial intersection of two arterials in Houston. I don't think Houston is especially that much worse than any other city when it comes to this. But I do think that we think a lot about transit. We think a lot about transit access. We rarely think about the pedestrian experience associated with alternative transportation. It is, and the fact of the matter is, and I can tell you this is true in my own neighborhood right now, you want to commute to work by bus, which I used to do at Rice. Well, that's fine, but your trip one way is going to be fine. Your trip the other way is going to be terrifying, because you're going to have to cross an arterial street to get to the bus stop. What's interesting to me about Houston, as many of you may know, and I got to say, Houston was supposed to be the site of the National Planning Conference in 2020, in March of 2020. And that, of course, was canceled. And I think that's really too bad, because I wanted a situation where Houston was shown off to the planners of the United States, because there's a lot of really great things here. It's like LA, it's a city of great neighborhoods. Also, it is an unparalleled city for green space. Houston is built around 7 bayous. There is now 120 miles of greenways along the bayous that are all connected to one another. You can walk or run or bike all throughout the city without interacting with cars in any way. So one of the things I always say is, there was the Cultural Landscape Foundation came to Houston a few years ago, and the guy who runs that, I can't remember his name, said that there were three periods in Houston's history. One was the infrastructure era, which was when they built the freeways in the 60s and 70s. The second one was the monument era, when they built all the office buildings in the 80s. And you can see this in LA too. And then the third one is the landscape architecture era, where they built all the bayou greenways in the 2010s and in the 20s and 2010s. And I always said there needs to be a fourth era, where the people who are all walking and riding their bike on the greenways crawl up the hill to the street and start trying to walk on the street and realize how frightening it is. I think that for a variety of reasons, including the increasing size of vehicles, it's become much more frightening to be a pedestrian than it ever has been before. And I think that's a real problem for cities.
I want to come back to something I said initially and that you've exemplified in the past few responses, which is you've written many books. Some are very analytical. Guide to California Planning is essentially a textbook. This is so autobiographical and so drawn from your life experience and connecting your life experience to your observations and preferences about cities. What did it mean for you to dig into your autobiography, to your own biography this way? And how did that clarify or unearth some of your urban sensibilities sort of writ large?
Well, I think I've said that I've talked about growing up in that small factory town in upstate New York and the urban PTSD that resulted from it. But it really made me try to think about why place, I'll talk about prosperity separately if you want, but why place has always been so important to me. I was deeply rooted in place. I think I mentioned in the book that my father, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather all lived and worked their entire lives within a 1-mile radius in this little town. And so I was deeply, deeply rooted in that place. And it was a painful experience to extricate myself from it. And that's part of the reason I had to move so far away to such a different place, such as LA. But it made me, one of the really interesting things about what's happened during our working careers, and I'll speak to the people on this call, is that small cities have been, such as Marcia's Pasadena, have been revived as urban gems in a way that we couldn't have imagined in the 70s, right? And so to see these small urban places, such as downtown Ventura, such as so many of the small downtowns in Southern California, emerge as urban gems for the first time in decades is something I never expected. And it's truly extraordinary. And I can remember, Marcia, I was hired right out of planning school when I was mostly a writer to do some promotional writing for a PR firm that had been hired by, I think the guy's name John Wilson, John Wilson, and who was one of the original renovators of downtown Pasadena, right? And I can remember in 1985 going to see John Wilson, and like stepping over homeless people, stepping over broken bottles, being allowed in through this very onerous security system to go up to his very luxurious condo above some probably porn shop, right? And so to go from that point to the urban experience we have in small cities all over California and all over the United States today is a miracle to me. It's truly remarkable. Growing up seeing that very small town urban fabric disintegrate, it's a miracle to me to see it come back. It's in a different form. It's certainly not as equitable. It's not as all-encompassing, but it is really miraculous to see.
Let me wrap up my questions with something that builds on that and that you alluded to originally, which is the book starts in upstate New York, your life starts upstate New York, then we spend a lot of time in California. We're at this moment now, California is seemed economically and demographically invincible for the past few decades, just as upstate New York probably did in the 60s with the Kodaks and the Carriers and IBMs and you name it.
Right.
Where are we now in California? Are there lessons in California that we can draw from upstate New York,
or down,
and even vice versa,
or downstate? When I was a young man in the 70s in New York, that was when population and economic growth ended, both upstate and downstate. The factories closed in upstate. Downstate, of course, New York City went bankrupt. You know, Ford to City dropped dead, all that stuff. What New York State had to do at that time was reinvent itself based on a different kind. It took a long time to do, but it had to reinvent itself on a different kind of economic and demographic model. It could not live off of population growth anymore as it had throughout its entire history. And it had to reinvent itself. New York City reinvented itself, frankly, much more narrowly as a financial center rather than a broad-based working to middle-class manufacturing center. Upstate New York has gradually, interesting, and COVID played a role in this, has gradually pulled itself out of its tailspin, but of course the population has continued to decline. I kind of want to write an essay about California that's titled, "Is California the New New York?" By which I mean to say, is it really not going to grow in population anymore? And if so, what does that mean about the way California is governed and all of the economic underpinnings, especially of planning and development in California? So much of California, not just planning, but sort of development finance is based on the assumption that the population is going to continue to grow and there's going to be a lot more real estate development, right? Impact fees, Melrose districts, all these things, right? What if that all stops? Then what do you do? That's something that no one in California has ever confronted before. And I do think that, I actually think New York State is uniquely, other Northeastern and Midwestern states went through this, but I do think that New York may be uniquely positioned to provide lesson, having been the previous world leader, right? Uniquely positioned to provide insight into where California goes next. I haven't thought that through completely, but I do think that that's, but I do think that that is something to consider, and that is something that I intend to think about and write about in the months ahead.
Conversely, real quick, if you were one of the people leaving California who can work from home, would you consider Arizona or Nevada, or would you consider upstate New York, Auburn, Syracuse? Do those cities offer something for today's migration patterns?
That's a really interesting question. The obvious answer is to go to the Intermountain West. It's the Intermountain West that is winning the fight for California refugees, right? As you know, Josh, my daughter and her family moved from Berkeley to Bend during COVID. I have no blood relatives left in California because my niece and her family moved from San Diego to Phoenix. During COVID, I would say it doesn't take very many Californians to screw up a town in the Intermountain West, and we saw a lot of that during COVID. Speaking of my hometown of Auburn, New York, I was in Auburn last week or the week before, and I was talking to actually the economic development director for the county, who lives in this beautiful historic neighborhood right next to downtown. And he described to me 4 new neighbors he's had during COVID, all of whom are remote workers from other states, including from LA. And I think probably what happened is during COVID is that the big metropolises like New York and LA, their hinterlands grew. So that now you're from New York, but you can go 5 hours to Auburn, be a remote worker, have a high quality of life. If you need to go to the office once a month, twice a month, it's not a big deal. Or if you need to have a meeting down there every now and then. Same thing for Phoenix and LA, same thing for Oregon and the Bay Area. So I haven't quite figured this out yet, but it is essentially created a new, broad, bigger hinterland for major metro areas. The other thing, and Richard Florida has been pretty articulate about this, it has done is it has strengthened second and third tier cities at the expense of first tier cities. First tier cities are really big, they're a huge hassle, they're really expensive. Second and third tier cities have added a lot of amenities in the last, I don't know, 10 or 20 years. They're relatively cheap. They have a high quality of life, even from an urban perspective. And so they are going to be the winners, I think.
Well, let me back off. And Marcia, if you want to orchestrate the Q&A, or if audience members just want to shout out questions for Bill, please do so.
Yeah, fire away. Nobody has any questions.
I think Marcia does, but her mic is muted.
Thank you. Is it okay? Okay now. I was going to say that we really want to make this a lively conversation. We have this wonderful treasure in Bill. We don't have him for much longer on the clock. So I really welcome you to jump in, ask tough questions. Softball questions are fine too, but
Or tell me I'm wrong about something.
yeah, tell him he's wrong.
I have a quick question, if you don't mind, real quick, and I know Jackson, I saw his hands up there. I would like to ask Bill, yeah, we've been on using Zoom and everything for the last 3 years. We still, even to this moment, we still have problems making sure we're muted or unmuted and that sort of stuff. But is there going to be a place for first tier cities? You're making it sound like first tier cities may be kind of diminishing and disappearing. Not totally, but I suppose, but maybe things are spreading out more and more.
This is another thing I've been thinking about and doing some research on. I'm really interested. Ever since in the telecommunications age began 175 years ago with the invention of the telegraph. And if you read the literature about what people thought was going to happen to cities and places with the invention of the telegraph, it sounds a lot like today. It's going to be the death of distance. The telegraph is sometimes today known as the Victorian internet. In the 1840s, people said that the telegraph would annihilate time and place. And yet there is still a reason for certain types of activities to occur in very concentrated formats. And that has, every time over that last 175 years, the telephone, the television, every time over the last 175 years, someone has predicted the death of dense human settlements, that has not occurred. And I think it's, and yes, people like us will be able to work on a mountaintop if we want to. But the truth of the matter is most of the economy, that doesn't drive most of the economy, right? It doesn't drive manufacturing. One of the interesting things, I've spent a lot of time in Austin lately, which of course, with some validity, considers itself the center of the universe at the moment. And what's really interesting is that everybody who is in Austin today as part of tech wants to be part of a place, just like they used to want to be in Silicon Valley. And and as used to be the case in Silicon Valley, that tech economy is connected to manufacturing in Texas. So, and then, you look at, I realize they've paused this, you look at Amazon's HQ2 whole big crazy competition, and they picked Arlington, Virginia. And part of the reason I think they picked Arlington was the entire AWS system it lives off of the backbone of the fiber that surrounds the Pentagon. So there are certain kinds of activities that still have to occur in densely concentrated. There's still a locational benefit to lots and lots of things. People like us have been dispersing for a while, also finance people, right? You don't have to be on Wall Street anymore. But I still believe in two things. One is the economic necessity of agglomeration of certain types of economic activities. And the other is the preference of a large part of our population to want to be in interesting, interesting amenity-driven places that can only be where amenities can only be provided with density. So I don't think it's the annihilation of time and space. I don't think it's the death of distance. I don't think it's the end of cities. Cities will change. I think I think the first tier cities are in for a rough time. But eventually, I think, throughout history, places like New York and San Francisco have had such a qualitative attraction that they always come back or reinvent themselves. That's the other thing. I'm sorry to go on about this, and I'll stop in a minute. But one of the things we find is that successful cities reinvent themselves all the time, right? One of the things I say in the book is, how did Boston go from being basically a whaling town to the center of higher education in the world, right? It had to reinvent itself over and over and over again, and it was declared dead several times in the process.
Thanks, Bill. Jackson, you want to? Yeah.
Thanks. I guess my question is, I'm kind of a housing activist outside of work, and actually in Ventura County.
Yes.
So I think you're familiar with a lot of our issues here. I'm wondering how you would approach, trying to get more housing, and especially in suburban communities in California, but just throughout. And if places become more successful, if we're, because we're all trying to make our communities more lively and more of an attractor, is there a way to do that without the negative effects of gentrification, like, displacing people? Because that's always a big concern that I encounter. So.
Yeah, Jackson, that's a good question, and it's always good to hear the Ventura County perspective. And I think you live in Thousand Oaks, as I recall. I always want to differentiate between gentrification and displacement, between investment and displacement. And what I generally try to say is, investment is good, displacement is bad. So don't deflect investment in order to avoid gentrification. Figure out how to use the investment to the benefit of the people who already live there. That is in a gentrifying neighborhood that might be poor. In a more affluent neighborhood, like I'm right, you live in Thousand Oaks, right? When you see what's happening on Thousand Oaks Boulevard, I think sometimes success builds on success. The first one, and I think you're going to see this in Thousand Oaks, the first project is going to be greeted with enormous resistance, and then people are going to realize, hey, this is not so bad. I kind of like this, and so they want, even if they still live in their single family home, they don't mind living in close proximity to all that cool stuff. Going back to Arlington, that's clearly what happened in Arlington, where people who bought single family homes a billion years ago, before the metro was put in Arlington, A, they're now rich. but B, they can walk from their comfortable single family home, whether they're NIMBY or not, to all this cool stuff. So I think success breeds success. I think. I see that Ken's got his hand up too.
Ken Bernstein.
Hi, Bill. Great to see you. I wanted to kind of build upon some of the discussion about, the autobiographical nature of your book and the path that you've taken in the planning field. I think one thing that's always really struck me about your career path, I don't know that there's anybody in our field who has had a more diverse set of roles. I see Michael Wu is with us, and maybe he comes close as having been an elected official, a planning commissioner. I mean,
I've never been a dean, though.
Oh, okay. Well, you've been in academia as well, but
yeah, right.
A mayor, a city council member, obviously a writer, observer, academic, and a planning director ultimately, and as well in San Diego. And just was hoping you might reflect a little bit about those different roles and the role of politics as well in the planning process, and
Right.
whether you found the political involvements that you've had as rewarding as writing and observing, and the more dispassionate roles that you played in the planning process, and the role of planning and politics, if you might reflect on that, and which you found more ultimately rewarding in your career path.
Another way of asking your question would be, why can't this guy keep a job? But basically, I devoted the first half of my career to writing and observing and researching, and the second half of my career to doing stuff. And that's a pretty logical progression. I think there came a point where, well, this is not uncommon for people who run for office. You know, first as a journalist and then as a planner, I sat in the audience for 25 years and I looked up at the dais and said, I can do better than these clowns, right? Which is how a lot of people get into politics, I think. But I have actually found I love writing. Writing is my first love, and if I'm not writing something cool, I'm unhappy. But I'm also at the point now where I want to do stuff, and I don't want to write just for the sake of writing. I want to do things that make a difference and change things. Right now, I'm working here in Houston with a philanthropy and a bunch of community groups in a underserved neighborhood to try to figure out how to organize themselves and position themselves to get maximize the funding off of the IRA and the infrastructure bill that they can get. And if you can put that structure together just right, then you could do something really cool that could be a national model. And that's just as rewarding to me as writing at this point. And because it's really a puzzle, it's how do you structure things for maximum impact? When you're writing something, and you know this, Ken, because you've written a lot and you wrote your book with Shafe. Having a maximum impact as a writer involves structuring words and paragraphs and arguments in a powerful way. I see a great similarity between that and working out in the real world to make things happen by bringing people together, structuring things, structuring arguments in a powerful way. The second half of my career, I've done more doing than writing, has been far more fulfilling than I ever would have expected.
I have a question, Bill. It's a practical thing. I've been planning for maybe 40 years, and I feel that there's a neglect of the public realm. I live in downtown Pasadena, and I walk a lot, and I'm in fear of my life, and I don't feel that anybody's in charge of the public realm except traffic engineers and public works people. And knitting things together, what relates to what, they're in their silos and they all have their programs. And it's very frustrating because I want to walk, not because it's the right thing to do, it's just because that's the best way to get around. But I don't see anybody taking responsibility for the public realm in the sense that planners spend a lot of their time entitling projects, processing and writing staff reports and all private things. So could you, given your experience as a public official and a planner, could you give us some insights into that issue? Chief of placemaking is how some people put it.
I think that's absolutely right. The planners too often are pigeonholed as land use regulators, private land use regulators. And when I teach planning, what I say is that there are two strands of planning history. One emerges from design and the other emerges from law. And we pay too much attention to the legal side and not enough attention to the design side. So if you go back to say the Daniel Burnham plan of Chicago in 1908, there's nothing in there about private land. It's all about the public realm. It's all about how you create a great public realm in order to set the table for private development.
Right.
And for however this has emerged, planners have been pigeonholed as land use, as zoning regulators, and have yielded the public realm to traffic engineers. That's right. And it really requires visionary city managers, of whom there aren't very many, and visionary elected officials to say, no, those things have to go together. That's really hard to do. I've never known quite how to do that. But there has to be some way to put concern about the public realm and concern about the private realm together. That doesn't necessarily mean planners have to be in charge of it, but it does mean that that both of those have to be furthered in the service of placemaking.
Now, one thing is that the value of place redounds to the private sector.
You would
So
think.
Location, if you put it location, 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 the obvious is connection.
Right.
But to get someone through to some planners who do design review that you're building a place, not a
Right.
building, how does it fit? Architects many times are so enthralled with their own buildings, they don't look beyond the boundaries of the private.
And developers don't want to look beyond their boundaries because they don't want any of the money to leak out.
So the logical thing is that people should care about place because, and the public, because it creates value for their own private.
And one of the things that I say in the book, and then I realize Jesse's got his hand up, so we'll move to that
Yeah.
in a minute, is that people experience place all the time. They move through space all the time, and they're unaware of it. And one of the lessons that I would hope people would take away from this book, and this is what I say when I talk to a lay audience about the book, is that you are experiencing place every minute of every day, in your house, when you're driving down the street, you're walking down the street, you're walking down a hallway, you're walking into or out of a building, you're in a damn parking garage. And the places you are experiencing, you have a reaction to them, often emotional, you like them or you don't like them. And they are not accidents. They are a result of a set of political and economic decisions that are deliberately made by different people.
Yeah.
And the more you understand that that is not an accident, the better it is, because people become more engaged in what places look like. But Jesse's had his hand up for a long time, so we should go to him.
Hi, Bill. Perhaps you remember me from Claremont Graduate School.
Yes, of course.
Great. Thank you. Well, I'm now working for the Federal Highway Administration. So, we're in the midst of beginning to distribute, some might say shovel out, a lot of money under IIJA.
Yes.
And many of those projects, at least the first tranche that I'm seeing, are dedicated to the kinds of things that Marcia was just talking about, improving the street and walkability and bikeability and protecting vulnerable non-drivers as well. But my personal observation is that it is very disconnected, that it's really a bunch of separate actions funding different small projects, essentially all through cities, not through Caltrans here. So given that, I guess it's a good thing in some ways, but how, if you could turn to transportation and maybe focus on those kinds of things under the current administration and probably the next 4 or 5 years, how might those funds be used, coordinated, whatever, more effectively from a planning point of view?
That's a good question, Jesse. And you'll recall when we were at Claremont, a Graduate University Research Institute, that we worked on what do you do after Ice-T, and the was that we had created, in creating Ice-T in the early 90s, the Surface Transportation Bill, we had replaced a very specific goal of moving cars with a whole bunch of cool stuff that we thought we should do. And I think that we have never seen at the federal level since Ice-T a coherent, comprehensive understanding of what a different transportation system looks like that the federal government can support. I think and I go back to my point, which is not about transportation, but is about federal money, IIJA and IRA, what I was saying about working with the community groups in Houston. So often it is up to the community groups and the local government working together to pull those pieces together, so that at the local level, it's not random. They're not a bunch of small projects. And that can be very hard for a local government to do. There requires a lot of coordination, but I think the coordination is much more likely to occur at that level than at the federal level. to be honest with you. But that requires a lot of vision on the part of local officials, a part of community groups, and that's really hard to do. A comprehensive vision about how to do that is really hard.
One more quick thought is that there's some of what they're doing, a small amount is planning grants before construction grants. And it sounds like that's something you would very much endorse as a wise move. So that there's a little bit of encouragement to be found there as well.
Yeah, and I think I've also begun to reflect a lot on the role of philanthropy. And I think philanthropy at the local foundations at the local level can sometimes help everybody put the pieces together in a way that a government agency or a community group cannot, because they have money, because everybody answers their phone calls because they have money. They can begin to put the pieces together and see this kind of integrated approach.
I saw a hand from Tom Priestley. It went down, but Tom, do you have?
I think it was a thumbs up.
Oh, a thumbs up. Okay.
Is that right, Tom? That was a thumbs up, right?
Thumbs up,
Yeah, that was a thumbs up, because I was very pleased about this discussion about the need for placemaking integration of both the legal side and the urban design, the design side of things, and perhaps even using the urban design as a way to set the table for the private development. So I appreciate.
Well, that is, yeah, and one of the interesting things about in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a big rethinking of zoning and what zoning is really for. Is it racist? Is it discriminatory? I've always thought it's unduly prescriptive. And one of the things that's interesting is that in the last 2 or 3 years, as that's been going on, many planners and other people interested in placemaking have looked at Houston for the first time and said, "Hey, wait a minute! You have a whole city that you somehow built without zoning. How did you do that?" And part of the answer is, although the streets are still largely the arterial streets are largely in the hands of the cars, that has led Houston, both in the government and in the philanthropic sector, to focus more on placemaking in specific, public realm, to focus more on the public realm, both in specific districts where governance is stronger than in other parts of the country, and in these corridors, especially these natural and green corridors. So the decline of zoning, if I can call it that, might lead in some cases, as it has in Houston, to an increase in interest in the public realm.
Mick Hansen, I wonder if you have some observations. You're very involved with these issues of zoning and planning and placemaking and environmental. You've got it all. And I wondered if you have some observations or some thoughts to share or questions for Bill.
Well, what I think we're grappling with are the multitude of legislative mandates that are coming down from Sacramento. So I'm not sure, we have the kind of say-so and the ability to be able to envision the city as we want it, simply because the constraints from legislative constraints are way too many. And Juliana, please chime in.
Well, there's no question that that's true. And I've been working with the Turner Center, and just the other day, we came out with an initial cut on, I think that the unknown question about all these housing laws is what works and what doesn't. The Turner Center issued a report, when was it, Josh? Yesterday, which I was the lead author on, which basically took an initial cut at what's working and what's not. But I agree with you that a focus on, although a lot of housing production is necessary, a relentless focus on housing production without an equal focus on design can have a harmful effect, and actually can have a harmful political effect too. I don't necessarily think that, I'm not an advocate of, oh, we can't build any housing, or we have to, because to retain community character, or we have to, or we should maintain all control in local hands. I'm not sure I believe that, but I do think that there's a disconnect between the relentless push for housing production and the need to have good design. That requires, of course, a huge leap under current law. That requires a huge leap in the quality of objective design standards, which nobody has any experience with.
Well, and I agree that I'm not advocating for freezing building anything, but I think that locals and good actors should be in charge of what goes where when, rather than one size fits all dictates.
Well, I'm not sure how you square that with the need to ramp up housing production, which has not happened. I take your point. I think those two things are in tension.
Yeah, thank you.
I see Zeb Yaroslavsky's with us. Zeb, do you have some comments? You've been at it a long time.
Longer than me.
Well, I refer you to The Reluctant Metropolis. I'm cited in that book from time to time. I owe you a trip to Houston, Bill.
Yes.
The pandemic
do,
got in
Zeb.
the way.
That's all right.
I'm open to it.
Okay.
Yeah, I've just taken this all in. I just, the one thing that comes to my mind is that for those, everybody here is old enough to have seen the movie Back to School with Rodney Dangerfield, and he sits in a real estate class lecture hall, and the professor lays out a budget for a construction project, 50% for labor and 25% for materials and 10% for this and 5% for that. And Dangerfield raises his hand. I guess you might not see me. He raises his hand and he said, and the professor is a little peeved. He wasn't expecting any questions. He says, "What is it?" He says, "Well, you forgot to put 5% in there to bribe the building inspector." And I want to quote or paraphrase Gail Goldberg's line about LA zoning, and I don't disagree with most of what you've said, Bill. Especially small cities. Small cities, have a stake in what their central business district looks like, and what and there's a lot of community input and pressure. But in a city as big as Los Angeles, I'm reminded of what Gail Goldberg said. She said, in most cities in America, the value of a piece of property is determined by what the zoning is. In Los Angeles, it's determined by what a developer thinks he can get the zoning to be. So there's a developer right now. I'll give you an example. It's in my old district. Who they were entitled to build. The property was entitled for a 7 or 8 story apartment building on La Cienega, just south of Olympic. A developer bought it. I suspect he bought it for at least twice as much as it was worth, and wants to build this 27-story skyscraper across from a synagogue, next to an HPOZ, the South Carthay neighborhood. I mean, I don't think there's anybody on this call, and I know many of you, we've all stayed young, who understand the stupidity and the obscenity of putting a 27-story phallic symbol on a street where you could count on one hand the buildings that are taller than 1 or 2 stories. 8 stories is a pretty big building. It's one of the streets. I would say a pretty tall building. We rezoned when I first became a councilman. We rezoned most of the commercial retail streets, the neighborhood commercial streets, Pico, Fairfax, Westwood Boulevard, et cetera, at 1 VL, 45-foot, 3-story height limit. For whatever reason, there were some streets we didn't do. It was probably that I couldn't get the votes for it. And here comes a guy who I guarantee you, I bet my firstborn, just don't tell my firstborn I said that he paid more money than anybody would have paid for it, because that company, which has been I'll just leave it at that. Thought he could get the city to change the zoning, and in the meantime, the state of California comes in and kind of eviscerates whatever zoning was left on that street. And one of the problems with the state, Bill, with a lot of these this orgy of housing bills, I don't think there's a person at the counter in City Hall. I don't think the planning director has a clue as to what you can do where. Right now.
That is one of the things, the Turner Center thing that I worked on actually did point that out, that the capacity and the technical ability of the local governments to understand and implement all the laws is very limited, and somehow or other the state needs to provide technical assistance or something to help rectify that. And Zev, this will alarm you, but in several of the interviews we did for that report, speaking to pretty reputable developers lawyers, they said, we're the ones who are having to teach the planners what the law says.
That's right.
Because we're the ones who have the resources and the time to figure it out, not them.
And
I think Zev, you're right. That's a huge problem that the state is going to have to do something about.
And one other thing, and I'll shut up, but many of the laws are in conflict with one another. So there's a lot of ambiguity. It reminds me of the AB 283, in the days before AB 283, when we had community plans and zoning, and the two were in conflict with each other.
That's another thing. That's another thing that's another theme that emerged out of all those interviews we did. And I don't think this is going to happen. I think what the state should do is take a step back and take a deep breath and say, okay, here's all the laws we passed. Where are they in conflict? Where can they be streamlined to be more elegant and work together? And I don't think that's going to happen, because I think the individual legislators all want to have their fingerprints over particular bills. But we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I agree with you. Good to see you.
You too, Zev.
Zev, thanks for being with us. Are there any questions and comments that anyone has that would like to express them at this time? What I want to do is quickly go to Art Cueto on our Olympics colloquium. If you could just outline this for us, dates and basic what we're doing. Yeah, you have to unmute.
Art, unmute.
Unmute.
Hello.
Okay.
Okay, can you guys see my screen? So yeah, we're about ready to have our first live event since, well, before I was part of this organization. So we are super excited about our upcoming colloquium dealing with lessons learned for from the 1932 and 1984 Olympic Games. And here, let me just get out of this. And so, and how to apply those lessons, how to apply those lessons to the upcoming 2028 games. A lot of us in this group were around for the 84 games. I personally was an undergrad at USC at the time, and remember that time very fondly, but also remembered how the city really came around to being innovative and creative in the way they did things, like, for example, transportation planning. Alan, I'm sure you recall, and Zev possibly, and a lot of you, about the brave predictions about gridlock and inability to get from venue to venue during the games, specifically for one day where there were a lot of the Coliseum, Sports Arena, Dodger Stadium, they were all in use at the same time, and how people were not going to be able to go to work. Oh, thank you. During that time. And none of that materialized because all the local officials got together, collaborated. I really think that was the genesis of transportation demand management, if you will. And really, there's a lot of lessons that have come out of those previous experiences. And the question, I think it's very timely to stop and ask, well, how is this going to apply to what's going on for what's in the works for the 2028 games? Case in point, Metro's strategic plan, where they're date for that is 2028, and how that's leading to a lot of change in planning and investment. So I think it's a real good time to look at this. We're going to have, along with our speakers, we're going to have Rick Cole as a keynote speaker from the city of Los Angeles, who we all know. Barry Siegel, who wrote Dreamers and Schemers, our very own Mark Herwick. We're also going to have David Simon, who is a former vice president of the LAOC, Los Angeles Olympic Organizing Committee, to talk about the challenges that went into the planning of those games and the high level of collaboration that needs to take place with the multitude of city government, local cities that were involved. And also Renata Semrel from the LA 84 Foundation, their CEO and vice president, to talk about legacies of the games and what's come out of it. So yeah, we'll send out the registration materials shortly to everyone on our mailing list. It will take place on Saturday, May 20th, beginning at 8:30 a.m. at the Huntington Library. Cost is $60 per person and $30 per student. And registration includes both participation in the colloquium, lunch, and also admission to the Huntington Library Gardens and Art Gallery after the conclusion of the event. So hope to see you there in a few weeks.
Thank you, Art. And Bill, I want to extend our sincere gratitude and thanks for being with us.
Sure, my pleasure.
I met you 40 years ago when I was president of the Los Angeles Planning Group. And
really,
somewhere downtown, I gave you an award, and it had to do with journalism and planning. So you may not know, but we go back a long, long way.
That's hard to imagine, but yes, thank you.
So anyhow, thank you so much.
Could you repeat the name of your book, Bill? Because I came in a little late, so I want to.
This is the new book. It's Josh put it in the chat, but it's called Place and Prosperity.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and the links in the chat to the publisher's website.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful book, and it's interlacing of Bill's personal experiences and his enormous experience also doing the work of planning and studying it. So with that, board members or any other concluding, Mark, do you have any concluding comments? Or
this was a terrific event this evening. Bill, thanks so much for speaking about your book, and Josh moderating the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Mark.
Really,
thank you as always,
Pleasure.
Josh.
Thank you all.
Josh, it wasn't that much different from the typical conversation Josh and I have. But
okay.
All right.
Another day in the life, right?
That's right. Thank
okay.
you.
Good night, everybody.
Right.
Thanks again,
Good night.
Bill and Josh. Great
Night.
job. Thank you.
Thanks,
Terrific.
everyone.
Okay,
Bye.
good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Night.